another Skull Sessions podcast, and today my guest is Mike Allen. Is that correct?
Yes.
And all right, Mike Allen. So let's start with it, kind of like the required question of what got you started in this?
So when you say this, do you mean specifically writing, editing,
Yeah,
publishing?
specifically writing, because I know that you write. You're an editor. You're a publisher. I know that you're into heavy metal. I just asked you about that. You
Right.
know, so I think we'll need to talk a little bit about that because I love metal too. But and I like to trade some bands with you or whatever. But yeah. So I'm talking about writing.
Okay. So I suppose this may not be the absolute most fascinating answer, but I suppose my interest in writing uh, dates back to when I was a preteen and was exposed in even say second, third, fourth, fifth grade to fantasy works like the Lord of the Rings, Ursula Le Guin's uh, Earthsea trilogy, the Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, The Chronicles of Prydain, all that sort of thing. Suzanne Cooper's The Dark is Rising series, and I think this is true for a lot of us when we encounter these books that just really kind of send our imagination into overdrive, and an impulse arises to try our own hand at it. And I definitely had that happen. Although uh, I'm not like a lot of my friends in the writer sphere who immediately attempted to write their own novels when they're in like fourth or fifth grade or something like that. I did,
That is fucking horrible. Don't read it.
yeah.
But yeah,
But I definitely have friends, Nicole Corner Stace being one example, who did that. And I did not. I kind of dabbled at a little bit of this, at a little bit of that. Actually, when I was younger, I was much more interested in visual art. And I drew, and I drew a lot, which was something that was handy for when I got, when Dungeons and Dragons got introduced into the culture, and I started playing that, and drawing my own monsters and those sorts of things. But
you still draw a lot now? You're an artist as well, right?
well, actually, no, I kind of set aside being a visual artist once I made it all the way uh, to college. I studied art as an undergraduate at Virginia Tech,
Okay.
and discovered that when push came to shove, maybe I wasn't as into it as I thought I was. It was a weird lesson for me to learn, but um, while I was at Virginia Tech, I probably devoted way more effort into a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that I led all as dungeon master all four years that I was there. And uh my my first couple of years, the dungeon was just sort of a hack and slash ultra gory affair. I've skipped over the part where, as a teen of about 15 or 16 or so, I finally began to appreciate horror. And so that became a factor in the sort of adventures I came up with for the people I went through. There were lots of sort of horrific elements, lots of violence, etc. And then my junior and senior years, I had kind of a big mental change, and I became much more interested in uh, telling an interesting story than just sort of the violence of the moment. And I think hilariously enough, I think that's where I started to realize, oh, maybe it's a writer I've actually wanted to be all along rather than an artist. Uh, and in fact, my focus changed uh, in those last couple of years of college. By the way, I'm ancient, so that would have been in like 1990, 1991.
Well, I graduated high school in 1991, so
Gotcha.
not that ancient. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so I took some creative writing courses, wrote some short stories, tried sending out stories. That's when I first really seriously started trying to do that, was, at the tail end of my undergraduate years. And I made my very first short story sale, uh, and which was to a pay and copy print magazine that nobody would remember now. But I made my
What was the magazine?
oh, it was called Gateways, Past, Future, Sideways.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wait,
and
that whole thing was the title, Gateways
yes,
Past
that was the
Future.
title of the magazine.
Wait, what was the title of the story?
The story was called a Game of Tag, and
Okay.
it's not very good. Uh, this happened like right after I graduated. That and the story actually, it's more interesting to talk about its origins than the story itself. As you mentioned earlier, I am really big into metal. I guess I'm kind of an old school metalhead. I don't know a lot about all the subgenres.
It's crazy now. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's so
yeah, that
many.
that
Yeah.
exists now. But this story, A Game of Tag, was actually inspired by the Slayer song Expendable Youth,
Okay.
which of
Awesome
course,
song. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, Expendable Youth is about gang warfare. And so
Hmm.
I I I had this image, or a series of images kind of pop into my head as I was listening to the song about essentially a futuristic gang member, getting blown apart by gunfire, and then being brought to this sort of wetware factory where he's then essentially rebuilt and then sent back out on the street. And so that was
Kind of
the
a very sci-fi sort of Terminator vibe, right?
right. And so that was the concept of the story. The idea was sort of that all of at this point, kind of taking my cue from the cyberpunk stories of the 80s and 90s. At this point, all of these my idea was that all these gang members are all
Well,
sort of
like Necromancer and Snow Crash, and
right. They're all
like
essentially already cyborgs by
okay.
this point, so they can be rebuilt when they're wiped out. And like I said, the story isn't actually all that good, but it is an example. And it is an example of how heavy metal figured into my creative process. And despite, as I said, the story not being particularly awesome, the fact that I made that sale made me think, oh, okay, maybe I can do this. And
Right.
I started pursuing uh fiction writing and also poetry writing a lot more vigorously.
And
Uh,
how old were you at this point?
I would have been like 22. Yeah,
Okay.
22 years old. And so I had, I don't, I had, I had a harder road ahead of me than I realized.
Right.
It actually, I had this weird burst of good luck where I sold a handful of short stories just kind of right off the bat. And then and then that kind of died out for a bit. And
Well, were people just not buying your stuff, or they weren't really interested?
I wasn't making a lot of sales. Or of course, this was in the days of desktop publishing.
Right.
And there were a lot of people kind of trying their hand at being, their magazine publishers. There was a sort of boom of zines during that when I got started during that time. But a lot of times, what happened to me a lot is I would sell a story, and then it would turn out that whoever that editor slash publisher was, had not uh, had not done a very good job of, creating something that was stable that they could continue to do. And
Right.
so I'd sign a contract for the story and it would never come out.
Well, I think a lot of indie like publishers and producers and whether they own like a record company or like a book company or whatever, it's the same thing. It's like they're really into it and they think I'll just go into it and they don't do any research. They often aren't very good at marketing, So yeah, that happens all the time, I think.
Right, right. Yeah. So I had a lot of that happen in my first decade. And then in and then but also I had a lot of craft I still needed to learn, and I didn't have an it's that sort of catch 22. I still needed to learn more, I still need to learn how to better my craft, but I didn't know enough to understand what I needed to do better. So, that took a while to all sort out. And then
Did you
I
feel like it took you a little while to like develop like a voice and a style, like as opposed to like trying to be, like kind of like feeding off of your influences too much and not expressing yourself?
so it did feel that way. Uh, Although it's interesting what hindsight taught me. So I'm going to use an example. One of the one of the first stories that I ever came up with an idea for, back in the early 90s, when I first really started pursuing this, was a piece called "Let There Be Darkness," and it was also inspired by a Slayer song. It's inspired by "South of Heaven."
Yeah, I was gonna say this sounds like a very metal song.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, and this is a horror story, and I wrote it in future tense. So the the narrator, she is telling you something that she sees is going to happen,
Okay.
and uh and one of the things that she envisions is her own death, but um she is the daughter of this incredibly powerful celestial being. So when you know and so when he and so when as she's preaching this word, uh you know she is essentially swept up by a mob and murdered, and this causes her father, who is this sort of vast, Lovecraftian cosmic horror, sky filling sort of being, to come to Earth and wipe it out. And uh she she's talking about how she's tried to warn humanity that this is coming and it won't do any good. They're still going to kill her. It's still going to happen.
Right.
But anyway, so this is a story. It got accepted a couple of places and didn't come out, and then it was homeless for a while,
Uh,
and then it got accepted by this tiny another small kind of long gone zine called Penny Dreadful. Uh, a
I
really
remember that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So okay, so you remember this. So the guy who edited that, I believe his name, or the name he used, was Michael Pendragon. Uh,
That
he
sounded very familiar to me too. I think
Yeah.
that was the name. Yeah.
So he published that, and then he did this crazy project called the Bible of Hell, which was actually, where in which he basically took a bunch of pieces that he had published in Penny Dreadful and mixed it with some public domain stuff and actually spent what must have been a ton of money publishing this book. Like, it was one of the first times I was in like a perfect bound book. And I can't imagine, I have to imagine, he lost his shirt on it, as often happens with these things. But so this story was in that. And this story was in that. And then fast forward like almost 15 years, so we're talking, and uh and I get a notion. So you're familiar with Pseudopod, the horror podcast. They do audio adaptations of
Yeah,
horror
I'm not
stories.
familiar with them. No,
Okay, well, you should get familiar with them. They're awesome. Uh,
for shame, for shame.
yeah, and so I decided, because I was trying to come up with something they had adapted a couple of my more recent stories, and I thought, okay, I want to try something else on them. How about, well, why don't I try this old thing? And I sent them Let There Be Darkness. Again, that was something that was, I came up with all those years ago, and they took it, and they took it and they used it, and did an adaptation of it. And I was like, oh, well, maybe this isn't as unpolished as I thought it was. So this is the point I'm finally kind of I'm getting to, like, and then I reprinted it in my first full collection of horror stories, which came out in 2014. It's called Unseeming,
Okay.
and it turned out to be one of
Is that still available? Is it
oh
available
yeah,
everywhere?
yeah, I guess I could, this will be, I guess, a cover that I will
I
send to
mean,
you. But this is Unseeming.
oh, that's cool. Yeah.
And and
That's mostly what I do now. Is that makes me think of it. I do mostly do book covers now. Like,
okay.
I originally could decide if I wanted to be an artist or I wanted to be an author, and then I read like Watchmen and The Dark Knight. I was like,
Good
oh, you can
stuff.
do both, And it's actually a lot harder. I did an interview with comic companies. It's a lot harder than you think it is, but I love
Sure.
illustrations for stories. And like you brought up how stories that would interest you. It's like like I'm not one of those guys that likes to go to the park and just draw. Like I need an inspiration. I need a story to draw. So yeah,
Okay.
stuff like that. Like that book cover, would make me want to check out the book because it looks like there's an interesting story behind it.
Well, it's actually, though that cover was not created specifically for Unseeming, but it's actually a pretty perfect illustration of
Right.
what's in there. Uh, so to finish off, so Let There Be Darkness, I guess, another person who read Unseeming did another audio adaptation of it, and it ended up, I would consider it, I don't know if popular is the right word exactly. It's ended up kind of over my career arc being one of my best received stories. But it was something that I came up with all the way back, in the early 1990s, before I'd really made any progress at all. And what I kind of learned from that is that, uh what I kind of learned from that is, that there there came a point where the stuff that I had written earlier and was not being able to sell started clicking with people. And so maybe, while some of my problem was, some of my problem was needing to, better my skills. Some of my problem, I think, was, some of my problem, I think, was that, the wider, the wider publishing world had to kind of catch up to where I was at, or intersect it, or something along those lines. Veer sideways and intersect it, maybe. I don't want to
Or
make it
find
sound.
out that it's sellable and there's an audience for it.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's something with like a lot of bands and stuff like that. Like they come out and like the like comedy putting out, it's like, yeah, maybe we'll get a little bit of indie cred, but once they put it out, like it sells like crazy.
Right, right. So that's the point of that long convoluted story I went through is I think uh I was kind of all along the writer that I am now. I just had to get better at
Right.
it. If that makes sense.
Do you go back and re-edit any of your old stuff?
So, okay, so this is an opportunity to mention
Plug
my
something else?
yeah, this was my second horror collection, Aftermath
Okay.
an Industrial Accident. This came out in 2020. I'm Please pardon me for claiming some bragging rights here. So both of these books were Shirley Jackson Award finalists. You
Okay,
know,
that's awesome.
yeah, completely different sets of judges. So
Right.
I I feel very, very lucky. And that's the same artist did both covers. So they're which I hope sort of implies there's connections between the two books because there are. But in
Do
Aftermath,
you do that sort of Stephen King thing, like drop a little like hints of how it's all like one universe, like everything's kind of
I've been doing that
connected?
more and more, not everything is connected together. I haven't tried anything that crazy yet, but I do have instances where worlds, if you want to put it that way, that originally,
Collide.
yeah,
Okay.
originally they weren't connected, but now they are because I thought of a way to do it. Um, so in Aftermath of an Industrial Accident is a story called Puppet Show, and that is a rewritten story of one of those pieces that I mentioned that I came up with in the early 90s and found a home for, and then the person the zine that accepted it went under, and I was never able to place it anywhere else. And so when I was getting ready to put out Aftermath and needed more material, I thought, well, why don't I go look at some of these older pieces and see what I think is salvageable? And I looked at that one and I was like, man, I would love to get this one out finally. And it did need some rewriting. It did need some rewriting, but I did rewrite it and put it in the book. And it's another story that the reviewers who have read the book have kind of highlighted it. And some that story, Puppet Show, I think you'll appreciate this. It's also a very metal story. It imagines this kind of, again, kind of a cyberpunkish scenario where you have this sort of shock rock metal band that kind of does, the Alice Cooper slash Wasp slash whoever would do this today thing. And they fake murdering people on stage, as part of their act and that sort of thing. Except, I bet you see this coming, except they're actually really killing people. And
So instead of being guar, it's more like they're black metal.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's sort of disguised, like they abduct people and turn them into props. They
Right.
don't just like toss they don't just like toss somebody out there. They'll you
Like
when
maybe lobotomize them a little bit so they're like kind of stupid. And then
well
I
so
don't know. I'm just projecting.
not so much. I guess that would be sort of nice of them to do that, but that isn't what they do. The people who this happens to, are totally aware of what is happening to them, but they've been rendered such that they can't, you know,
Vocalize it.
they
Yeah.
yeah, they can't say anything or act in any way other than what's been kind of programmed into them. Uh,
Okay.
and uh and it's a very, very over the top story. Like I've even got like lyrics written out to some of the songs, and you know the scenes that take place backstage are just like are just like total extreme gore. But it's fun. It's sure, at least for me, it was sure fun to write. And there's uh
Well, I think there's a big audience for that. I mean, look at how much like The Dirt sold. I don't know if you read the novel The Dirt about Motley Crue. Like, I'm not a Motley Crue fan, but it's like one of their I don't know one of their guys like it wasn't in the band. It was more like one of the technicians or whatever. And he writes a story. He just talked about what fuck ups they were.
oh
And like
sure.
and how like Vissy would get beat up all the time because he's an asshole.
Right, right. Well, I mean, Motley Crue is definitely a band. I mean, living on the edge,
Right.
to quote, Aerosmith, and uh, they, I saw them live. I guess it was they were touring Theater of Pain, and it was a great show. But I read about kind of the stuff that they did backstage, and I mean,
Right.
they killed the Hanoi Rocks drummer.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of appalled at them as people, but boy, teenage me still
I
love
try
that
to like
show.
separate the art from the people. Like, I love
Right,
Danzig stuff, but here Danzig's a huge dick. You
right.
know.
Well, everybody loves that video where he gets like knocked out.
Yeah, yeah.
But I also like Danzig's music, so
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
it's funny, the guy that knocked him out, he also runs I think it's a podcast, it's also a magazine, stuff like this. So
right.
he was like, hey, he's just talking to me about stuff. I was like, wait a minute, were you with that band where one of the members now did sick? He's like, oh yeah, that was me.
Oh, that's funny. Cool.
He's a nice guy, yeah.
So I don't know if what I've been talking about is what you wanted. I appreciate you kind of offering the opportunity to take the metal angle. I don't get that all that often.
Well, it's obviously informal conversation, so it's like
Sure,
wherever it leads, it leads. And obviously, I like metal, so I'm not offended by anything metal you bring up. But I did want to ask you two things, like you mentioned a little bit earlier. One is like you said initially, what kind of drew you in this whole world, where it was fantasy, like Lord of
hmm
the Rings and stuff like that. And I like Lord of the Rings, but most fantasy I didn't like. I just, to me it was boring. And then like it kind of, I felt like it kind of came back with like Game of Thrones and stuff like that, where it got like more violence and more over the top and more technical and stuff like
sure.
that. Is the stuff you write, it sounds like you do more cosmic horror than fantasy, but fantasy inspired you. What would you say about that? What's your take of that?
So it's interesting how things have panned out for me. As you mentioned, I'm not just a writer, I'm also an editor and publisher. Though those latter two things are not things that I imagined myself doing,
Right.
in those early years when I was kind of trying to figure out what art I was into, and then when I first started pursuing writing. But and uh as a writer, I tend I tend to turn dark. I write multiple genres, but they almost always my what I write almost always ends up having this really dark, horrific element, whether it's a fantasy story or a science fiction story, or kind of a noir inspired story, or a ghost story, or a splatterpunk story, or whatever.
No, well,
Uh,
I think there are people who can definitely do it. Like Richard Matheson, if he wrote like a fantasy story, it would still be like,
right,
as dark and awesome as I Am Legend or whatever.
right. But as a editor and publisher, I kind of skew differently. The stuff the stuff that I pick to publish by other people tends to tends to fall more in it tends to fall more in kind of the surreal fantasy genre. And so I have my own little company, my own little imprint called Mythic Delirium Books. And there's a long history behind that, which I don't know if you would want to get into that in this interview or not. But
Well, you can bring it up. I mean, I don't want. We don't have enough time for probably a long explanation, but I definitely like to hear about it.
sure. Well, so this year is actually the 25th year of Mythic Delirium's existence. And I have to kind of explain that a little bit. Right now it's called Mythic Delirium Books, and I actually do publish books. It began as in 1998 as a zine called Mythic Delirium, and I only published poetry. And it kind of
Okay.
it evolved over the the 25 years in between into what it is now. And this year I've published three books, which that's a lot of titles for me. Mythic Delirium is a micro press. It's small and deliberately small, because oftentimes, as with my writing, this is something that I am doing, outside my 9 to 5 job. Uh,
What is your nine? You're a teacher, right?
no, actually, uh, my actual day job right now is I'm a member of the media relations team at Virginia Tech.
Right.
Another thing that I would,
Well, I saw Virginia Tech. I was like, oh, teacher, but yeah.
yeah, no, well, I'm technically a faculty member, but I don't teach any classes. I'm one of the people who pitches stories about our professors to national media. That's
No,
that's
okay.
that's my actual day job, and it's fun. I was before then. I worked for a newspaper, the Roanoke Times here in Roanoke, and that actually I was actually there for 25 years. You're probably well aware the newspaper industry is in deep trouble right
I was
now.
dying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I held out as long as I could, and when I finally jumped ship, I got really lucky and landed in a place that fits me very well.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I remember. Sorry, sidetrack
no,
real
that's
quick.
okay.
Um, I remember when I first got out of high school, and I was like, I want to make it. Maybe like I kind of stumbled into doing political illustrations for Mad Cat magazine,
Oh,
and not Mad Magazine,
cool.
Mad Cat Magazine.
Well, still,
And so I remember I went to an illustrators meeting, and this is back in like the 90s, and they were talking about how it was dying. So I can only imagine
right,
it's dying even more now.
right. Yeah, unfortunately so. Uh, unfortunately so. But so to rewind, so so the three, I felt like maybe the best way for me to sort of convey the difference between myself as a publisher and myself as a writer is to show what the books that I have published this year, and you'll just see the difference in the nature of the cover art. So the first book we put out this year, this is a novel, The Twice Drowned Saint by C.S.E. Cooney. She's a World Fantasy Award winning author. In fact, her book that won the World Fantasy Award is also one that I published.
Yeah,
Very, very proud of that, called
it's
Bones.
awesome. What is it called?
And so this is a novel about this is a novel about um, a city that is behind these gigantic walls of ice, and it is ruled by it is ruled by angels. And by angels, I mean, if you see this figure on the cover that has all the eyes and the feathers, and so the angels who rule this place are biblically correct angels. I think that's the phrase that they use these days, and most of them are quite evil and tyrannical. and the book chronicles the adventures of two women who are chosen to be saints for one of these angels, and how they end up kind of leading or assisting a rebellion against the status quo. Very, very, very fun, wildly original book. Um,
Yeah, it sounds interesting. Yeah, I know that there's kind of like this interpretation like angels are like all fluffy and friendly now, but they weren't. Like
they were
yeah,
terrifying.
they were terrible. Like people would shit the pants over it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I feel like it's kind of like the like all those like fairy tales and legends, and they kind of like Disneyfy them and spruce them up to make them like palatable for the American audience.
Right,
But
right. It's been way watered down.
yeah, yeah, but like in Little Red Riding Hood, like the wolf eats a girl,
Right,
and now
right,
it's on
right.
the
Very
grill,
much
they
like
actually
that.
get cooked.
Yeah. So the second book we put out, uh, as with CSC Cooney, this is a book that this is an author who we worked with before, Theodora Goss,
No, yeah,
and uh, this is she is somebody who a lot of her fiction and poetry has to do with kind of reimagining, as you mentioned with the Grimm stories. She reimagines stories from fairy tales and folklore, and uh, she has this uh, I don't know, how do I describe her approach. A lot of times one of the things that she does is she'll take kind of the girls and women in those stories and give them more agency in the reimagining of the story. But that's not all she does. A lot of times she also kind of modernizes them, and introduces other elements of magic and things like this. And this book, The Collected Enchantments, which is a brick,
yeah,
is it's kind of an overview of just about everything that she has written, uh, that she has written along those lines. Um, and it's a great honor for me to be able to do this book. She has a trilogy uh, called The Extraordinary Adventures of the Athena Club that was published by a big publisher, by Saga Press, and that did really well for her, and she started working with us, at the same time that those books were making waves. So that was that it was really great for myself and Anita to be able to have this relationship with her, and now to be kind of the steward of this sort of landmark book in her career is very cool. But again, obviously this is very fantasy.
right.
This is not. I mean, some scary things happen in some stories, but this is really not a horror collection at all. And then
Right. Well, I feel if it's a well told story, it doesn't really matter, what
right.
label you put on it, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi or horror, speculative fiction or whatever. It
So
matters whether or not it's good.
now I'm glad you feel that way, because the third book I want to show you this is a debut. Yukimi Ogawa is a Japanese writer whose work has appeared in like Clark's World and the Dark, and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and those sorts of publications. And she's interesting because, though she's Japanese, she lives in Tokyo. She writes her fiction in English. So this isn't a translation. This is how she actually wrote these stories. And she does something that I really like. Like her stories, uh, her stories can be like horror, science fiction, fantasy, romance, mystery, and that will be all in one story.
Right.
She'll in a single story she'll run the full gamut. Uh, and she does she also, something she has in common with Theodora Goss is she takes stories out of folklore and kind of updates them and makes them her own. But she also writes these really wildly original stories that also have these genre blend, this
Well, I
genre
think
blend that I
also
mentioned.
some people have this idea that like the original stories are the base. Like there's some like almost like biblical script that you have to follow. It's like those were orally told. Most people could not read, so
Right, right, right. Yeah,
it's like
there's
it's playing telephone like around a classroom. It's like they changed a little bit with everyone that told them. And some people said, "I'll make it a little darker." Some people said, "I'll add this character." It's like so. There's not a definitive version of those stories,
oh sure, yeah. All the rules are basically illusions.
right?
So
Well, that
that's
kind of goes in life.
right, right, right. So what I hope to kind of illustrate by sharing those three books is, as what I do as an editor and publisher is just, it's like for reasons that are in a way kind of inexplicable, I have a different mindset. I don't, like, you would think somebody who writes horror like I do would also, be trying to put out horror collections. But no, instead I go for these I go for these, fantasy titles, and these titles that are actually kind of hard to classify. And that's what Mythic Delirium concentrates on. Uh, and then,
So is that more like the scope of your publishing, and then your actual writing? It's more like straightforward horror, or is cosmic
right,
horror?
right. Yeah, so I mean, my horror books are my horror books, they also blend genres, but they're very consistently horror, whatever
Right.
else they are. Yeah, but that's not necessarily true of what I choose to publish. Uh, I did have, so back in 2020, the same year that I put out Aftermath, I put out this anthology, uh, a Sinister Quartet, and this is, uh, you know, this is, I guess I was thinking of it as my model was sort of different seasons, although, or, there's a Joe Hill also did kind of a, I can't read this. Oh, Strange Weather. Joe Hill also, I have it over there. I read the spine, a similar thing where you have like four novellas.
Right.
This is that, but it's four different authors. And so this is, this is kind of leaning horror, but at the same time, uh
And that's put
because
out by your
because
press.
yeah, this is through Mythic Delirium books.
Okay.
But at the same time, I found readers were sort of confused by it because the styles were so wildly different among the four pieces. And in fact, you see C.S.E. Cooney here. Her her story in this is an earlier version of the Twice Drowned Saint that I've now brought out as its own novel. Uh, whereas the concluding story in that book is a piece called The Comforter that I wrote, that is about as twisted and nasty as it gets. So there was, I conceived it as kind of just the book gets darker as you go, but I found there was some pushback to that from readers because either they clicked with the first couple of stories, which were very extremely imaginative but lighter on the horror elements, or they clicked with the last couple of stories, which were, uh, heavier on the horror elements. And I would say still imaginative, but much more firmly within the horror box.
Right.
Think of it that way. Uh,
Do you
So
feel like
that
being
that was maybe an attempt for me to fuse everything together, I guess you could say.
like a variety of interests? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you feel like being a publisher takes away from your writing? Like you spend more time writing, but you're doing all this like little technical editorial bullshit.
So I suppose it can. Um, what I have found, like I've done in the in the past, I've done a couple of years where I've like really kind of reduced my publishing and editing and focused solely on writing. And I find I keep coming back to publishing because I genuinely enjoy I genuinely enjoy the process of kind of finding and promoting other voices.
Okay.
You I have one of the things about Mythic Delirium is we tend uh, we tend to get behind writers who we tend to get behind writers who aren't necessarily clicking with the biggest of the more commercial publishers, to put it that way. Although even that I have to qualify because some of the folks I've worked with have gone on to do really really well.
Well,
you
and
know,
some of the big publishers put out absolute crap. So it's like now you can't just trust them because they're big.
sure. And I think I'm very used to having this going on as I'm writing. So I don't I don't think it what I learned from what I learned from those years where I did cut back on the publishing stuff to focus on writing is I'm not necessarily faster as a writer when I don't have that other stuff happening. So whereas I feel like when I have the publishing stuff going on, that can kind of feed the things that I'm doing for myself as well. I learn things that kind of keeps me plugged into the community, uh, and so I don't have I, right now I have no right now I have no reason to feel like I should be favoring one or the other. I just do it all or try to do it all.
Are you writing something right now? Are you about to put out something right now?
Well, interesting that you should ask that. So, uh, I mean, I'm working on a new short story. That's probably not worth talking about yet because I don't know if it's going to sell or not to the place I want to send it to. I did um, I did recently sell another story called Machine Learning to a magazine called Cosmic Horror Monthly. And that's going to come out next year. They've brought out a couple of pieces of mine already, but probably more important to mention, uh, I have scheduled for next year, knock on wood, a novel and a short story collection that will hopefully come out in the times that I envision them coming out. Uh, the novel, which will be my second published novel, is called Trail of Shadows, and that book I'm under contract with Broken Eye Books, which is a small press based on the West Coast, who's brought out a number of exciting titles over the past decade or so. I'm really thrilled, to be working with Scott Gable, and we're to the point we're to the point where a cover has been commissioned. And I needless to say I'm kind of on tenterhooks waiting to see what this is going to look like, but it sounds, based on the description, it sounds like a lot of fun. And the aim right now is for this to come out at some point in the spring. Though schedules can change.
Right.
And Trail of Shadows, the log line that I came up for it is American Gods meets Twin Peaks on the Appalachian Trail.
Uh,
Yeah,
both are awesome. Like
yeah.
I remember I saw Twin Peaks when I was a kid, and it blew my mind because it's way better than like all the other crap like MacGyver and whatever
Oh yeah,
that's
yeah.
around. You know, but in American Gods, I thought it was really strong. I thought the ending was a little bit weak, but like the idea behind the story was great. Although
Sure.
Neil Gaiman is just he keeps getting better and better. So
That
everything he
novel,
writes,
so I haven't seen the TV series, but I have read the novel, and I I don't know if this is what you mean, but I know I was able to guess the ending. Uh
right?
which uh but like so much, all the places he kind of went along the way were just great. Um and
I was kind of hoping it wasn't going to end the way it did. Like I thought it might, but I was kind of hoping, like it didn't end like in a very definite. This is what happened. It felt to me like it was kind of like a Stephen King ending.
right. So Trail of Shadows, if you kind of look at those two reference points, it's a very strange book. But some of my short stories that are in Unseeming and Aftermath of an Industrial Accident tie into Trail of Shadows. And so that's, not like I think I have, hundreds, thousands, hundreds, whatever of fans out there dying to see this, but I'm very excited about having this book come out. And so and thus the people who have actually read some of those stories will be like, oh, so this is what's going on.
Right.
you
Well,
know
it might also really blow up when you die. I mean, that's what happened to Poe and Lovecraft. You know,
well,
like Lovecraft died basically in obscurity, and then
sure.
people dug out his stuff, and now like he would be a multi-millionaire if he was alive now.
I've often wondered. So, I don't think too hard about whether something's going to blow up after I die, because of course I won't know. But uh you know the uh I've some an idea that has entertained me a lot that you will appreciate as a metal fan is that I've often wished that I could play Metallica's Call of Cthulhu instrumental for him and just see how he reacts. Or their
He might have hated it. I mean, I
well,
love
he
Mel,
might
but I
have.
don't think that even like really like he was kind of a weird guy. You
Oh
know,
yeah.
like when he was a little kid, like his mom would lock him in the house to say he was too ugly to go outside. It's like he had a lot of like things going on with him, but
He he had a very sad life, and he had a lot of very unfortunate points of view, and
yeah.
that everybody knows about now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, but
Uh,
I think I mean people bring up like he was racist a lot,
mhm.
and the thing is, he was like a scared little kid, but then he became an adult and he was still that scared kid. The mom would lock in the house. So
Right.
I look at it more as like him going, "What the fuck?" Than him like having like that Nazi skinhead, sort of like the resolution to like everybody like me I hate and I don't look at it the same way.
Sure. I mean, it's just he's kind of a pitiable person.
Right. And then
But he
married
came up with
a
some
Jewish
really
person.
interesting, stories and monsters and
Yeah, well, and then he married a Jewish woman and he moved to
right,
Brooklyn.
right.
So it's like he couldn't even stick with like he'd have some bad ideas and be like, yeah, well, okay, I was wrong there. And then
Right. Yeah. And that, I mean, and that's fascinating that it happened. And of course it ended, uh, the way that ended was also kind of pitiable. She kind of moved on with her life and he didn't so much.
yeah,
Uh,
she moved on to I think Chicago. She found a job somewhere else,
right.
and she was trying to get him to go, and he was like,
He
"Well, I'm
wouldn't do it.
already so far from Providence, I don't want to move again." And then they just kind of stayed married for a while, and then eventually got divorced. Yeah,
Right.
but I remember like in I don't know 90, I believe, is when I first read Lovecraft's work. This is the first time that I felt like it really spoke to me, like in a way that, like, it kind of expressed what, like, everybody seemed like they were biting their tongue, and not going full force, and that seemed like it really delved into that.
Well, so I can something that I kind of skipped over in my the origin story I shared with you earlier is how I actually got into horror, which is and so I when I was in third grade, my teacher, this was in Wise Primary School. This is in kind of the very southwestern tip of Appalachia in Virginia. Uh, for Halloween, he read to the class, had us all gathered in a circle, and he read to the class The Telltale Heart and The Raven. And I was this, I don't know how to explain it. I guess in a lot of ways I was a very sheltered kid, at least when it came to certain aspects of pop culture. And so I had never before encountered a story like that when my teacher read those. And I freaked the fuck out. I mean, literally was traumatized.
Well, also, what year was this?
Oh, this would have been. Hmm, it may be hard for me to nail the year down exactly, but probably 77, 78, somewhere in there. Uh, and
Things were a lot more mild back then. Like, you didn't have, like, people singing about, wow, wet ass pussy. So, like, people were shocked over the small things back
right.
then.
Well, I mean, Black Sabbath existed back then and was going strong, but that was not even
Oh, and I
remotely
remember
a
people
little
were
cat
freaking out
scratcher
over that.
commentary. Yeah,
Like
that
Sabbath is nothing compared to, like, Mayhem.
well, true. But so I had, I just like freaked out and I started having like night terrors and they never really went away. Uh but I these stories that had such power over me that I couldn't help but have this kind of morbid fascination. And so but I still at that point definitely did not like horror. Uh, but so fast forward a bit, and I mentioned that I've been exposed to J.R. Tolkien's, The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, I
Uh,
love the Chronicles of Narnia. They're awesome. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm not religious at all, but it's a great story.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it gets more religious as it goes. Like the fair, I think the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is even though there's definitely a sacrifice and resurrection element to it. It's still kind of a
Right.
universally
And Aslan
enjoyable
is supposed to
story.
be like Jesus, and yeah.
Right. But so I was so nerdily obsessed with these writers that I would actually read essays about them. That's the kind of kid I was. And uh, I actually got a book of essays about J.R.R. Tolkien, and one of those essays which was written by an author named Colin Wilson, who you might recognize as the author of The Space Vampires, which was made into the movie Life Force.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so he wrote kind of a critical essay assessing the Lord of the Rings, and there are all these different works of literature and authors that he kind of references and compares the book to. And one of the authors he frequently brings up as a sort of fellow fantasy author is H.P. Lovecraft.
It's
And
weird. I
so
would say Lovecraft is fantasy. Yeah.
yeah, and so I get this idea that, oh, if I want to read more stuff like this Middle Earth thing that I like so much, I should read H.P. Lovecraft. So
and it
so
sucks you in.
so I end up, I think the first Lovecraft story I ever actually got my hands on was The Rats in the Walls.
That's a great story. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I read that, but I'm still at this point not somebody who handles horror well. So once again, I freaked the fuck out. Like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. But I end up, uh, this morbid fascination with horror doesn't go away, and I actually end up reading like a whole collection of Lovecraft stories. I think another thing that might have influenced me to do that is I think I was in sixth grade when Dungeons and Dragons caught on with the kids that I went, or at least the nerdier of the kids that I went to school with in this coal mining town. And you may recall that the original deities and demigods had the Cthulhu mythos
Right.
included.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
It's like I said, he'd be a millionaire,
right,
multi-millionaire
right.
now.
And
So many
so
people have used stuff.
I end up reading, almost I don't I think there were a couple stories I never got to and didn't read until later in life, but I ended up reading like the almost the entirety of the Dunwich horror and other stories. And thanks to Pickman's model, for years I can't go into
Another great
specific.
story.
Yeah, but uh, so 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 and I end up also reading Stephen King, and of course Stephen King. I actually read Dance Macabre, his nonfiction book, in which he also sings the praises of Lovecraft and etc. Uh, and
Did you see The Mist, the movie The Mist?
I did. I
That he
I
said
did.
that was his ode to Lovecraft.
I think that makes total sense. I've read the story as well. Yes, that's it's very much a cosmic horror story. So so we get to about 15 or 16, and I have this sort of love-hate relationship with horror where, I can't stop myself from reading it, but I keep, stuff that doesn't really phase other people kind of scars me.
Right.
And but then along comes Clive Barker, uh, and his books of blood. And I remember seeing the sort of cheesy looking paperbacks with the rubber masks in the bookstores. This was like, where was this? This was I think we had moved from Wise. My family had moved from Wise to Roanoke at this point. In Wise, there were no bookstores.
Right.
Roanoke actually had like a mall with bookstores in it. And
That's
so
also a dying thing.
yes,
Bookstores.
yes. I mean, now it's sort of, now it's Amazon is kind of the 8 million pound gorilla, and
Yeah.
Barnes and Noble, is hanging in there, and then you've got indie bookstores trying to make a go of it where it's possible. But I remember seeing, those kind of cheese it, which I have them over here since you know
I think his first three books of blood, they're collections of short stories.
right,
But
right, and they have like these sort of cheesy looking rubber Halloween mask
yeah,
covers.
well, I
And
never saw those. They had the ones at my local library when I was a kid because we were like in military bases, and I just like check
gotcha.
out stacks of books. But I remember his first like the Yattering and the Yak and Tale of Two
Gathering and Jack,
Cities, yeah.
yes.
And I was like, these are so good. Like it blew my mind.
Well, so I saw that blurb, I've seen the future of horror, and his name Clive Barker,
Yeah,
Stephen King, like the ultimate horror blurb. And I read those, and those stories, I mean, they're extreme, but they're also really, really creative. And there's this, to my mind, there's kind of a joyfulness in how wildly creative they get. And reading those stories, something like another switch that had never thrown before kind of got thrown in my brain, and I started to enjoy horror stories for how they were crafted
you're right.
instead of just being like freaked out or not freaked out.
It's sort of like instead of looking at metal like, oh, Venom is metal. Like you look at people that are more complicated, like necrophagists. Like,
right,
those people are really talented. Well, I think it's all written by one guy, and then you get session musicians to play love with them. It's like, that guy is really talented.
right. Yeah. So it's sort of like that. And so it's at that point, I think, that I quit, I quit having this love-hate relationship with horror and just start loving it. And
Okay.
that's what kind of set me on the path to be at
That
least
that
what
broke
I
the
am now as a
boundary.
writer. Yeah. Uh, and so and I would have that reaction later to, Thomas Ligotti, Laird Barron, Livia Llewellyn, uh, and Brian Evenson. Some it doesn't happen with every single writer I read, but sometimes I'm like, wow, I love what this person's doing. And it's interesting. Uh, we're in kind of this horror boom right now, which I hope to be able to take advantage of next year. Please don't dry up before next year, horror boom. Uh, and, but
Hopefully, it's not that like 2 year grunge thing where it's like bum bum.
yeah. But the uh, it seems there's kind of this of course part of it is kind of the general the general atmosphere of the aftermath of the pandemic and all the political turmoil and
Right.
and I feel like that has I feel there's a way that that's kind of helping horror
It's
right
put
now.
more darkness in people. Like they see
Right.
more of the like depressing dark side.
And I
And my
think
my last book is called The End of the World. It's still shot up with the lockdowns.
awesome. Awesome. Yeah, and so but also I feel like there's this a whole lot of young filmmakers. The world of filmmaking is now much more accessible than it was, say in 1980. And a whole lot of these young filmmakers are there's a lot of young filmmakers who are kind of, you know, trying to kind of break into the industry and build an audience for themselves, and they're doing it through horror. And so there's this kind of explosion right now of small budget but really interesting and original horror movies. Enough to justify, like, the creation of a whole streaming of, well, actually multiple streaming services. There's Shutter, there's whichever one Bloody Disgusting is behind. I can't remember the name of it right off. The one that debuted Terrifier 2. Uh,
Yeah.
remember the
I,
next
I I don't know the I don't know,
Screambox? Is that what
yeah,
that's called? Screambox. Um,
maybe.
but so I feel like that is kind of having a rising tide floats all boats effect. At least for the moment. Hope
I
uh,
hope so. Yeah.
yeah, and
I
so
think I think people are getting a lot more like away from like the major like publishers or producers and companies, and more like if it's good, it's good. I'll give it a try.
right. So you don't necessarily have to have like that great big top down,
Right,
commercial publisher stamp for somebody. It helps, but you don't necessarily have to have it for somebody to give your stuff a look.
right.
uh and so I feel uh I've the point of my saying all that is that I feel more kind of excited uh than ever about being a writer who plays in this scary sandbox.
The
And
security sandbox.
yeah. uh,
Well, also, I hope you're right. I hope that's like, I read horror too, so I'd love for it to like, pick up more and for
oh
people to
yeah,
be more interested. What?
I said, oh yes,
Oh yeah. All right. So when I want to ask you the final question is, let's go back to metal for a minute. And
sure.
what are some of your favorite bands?
So I'm kind of old school, I suppose. If you Left to my own devices, I will usually pick something by Judas Priest or Motorhead. Uh,
Okay.
uh, Obviously they both of those bands have enormous catalogs. Motorhead kind of sounded the same all through the decades of their career, but it's
It
great.
doesn't mean they're bad though. Yeah.
Yeah. My favorite Motorhead album um is Orgasmatron, which that's the one that has, well, it has the song Orgasmatron. It also has Death Forever, which is I think the greatest metal song about Viking battle ever written. Uh, and Judas Priest, of course, has all these different eras to their sound. So there's a variety there. But um, I think my favorite Judas Priest album kind of vacillates between British Steel and Defenders of the Faith and Painkiller. Painkiller came
Have
out.
you heard the band Death did a cover of Painkiller? I think it's an awesome cover.
I have heard that. I
Yeah.
have I have heard that.
And
Yes.
Chuck Schuldiner made up all the solos in that song.
Oh, cool. I mean, so it's been a little while since I've heard that cover. I have heard it. Uh, I did they do? No, it was Cannibal Corpse, I think, that did Zero the Hero, which is a Black Sabbath song. Um, so I have uh I'm trying to think, okay, so who's a more recent band that I might have gotten obsessed with? Well, okay, so I don't know what you're going to make of this, but a band that I am listening to right now a lot is this really, I think in America they're very obscure. They might be better known in Europe. They're an Austrian band called Contrast.
Yeah,
And
I've heard of. Yeah.
and if you go look at their videos, you'll probably be like, what? Because they're very silly. Although I think that's kind of forgivable. I mean, almost all of Mastodon's videos are also very silly.
I remember when I
They're
was married.
as musicians they're very serious and come up with
The
amazing.
drummer's really good. Yeah,
Yeah.
really, really good. I remember I saw Mastodon at a little tiny show at the Hard Rock Cafe, and the drummer hit on my wife when I was married.
Oh wow.
But he didn't know it was my wife. It was totally cool after he found out. But I remember like she was Colombian, so she didn't. There's a little bit of accent, a little bit of a language barrier, and she didn't understand what he was trying to do, and he kept trying getting like
I
yeah.
see. That's hilarious. Well, their drummer's a pretty handsome dude, so I guess you can be flattered there in a way. Uh, so 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 Contrast, they call themselves, or they're referred to as, a crossover band, which kind of means that they'll jump into any genre at any time, which I guess if you think about it, that might actually sound like a familiar theme, but I love bands that are kind of willing to experiment like that. I was into Soulfly for a long time. I still am, for kind of the same reason. They bring in all these uh, surprise genres of music into kind of their new metal formula. And
Did
uh,
you like Sepultura towards the end, like with Roots, Bloody Roots, and all
I'm
that
like
stuff?
I can't count how many times I've listened to Roots. I've played that over and over and over again. That's another one. That's another one that I go to a lot. Um, and so lately I've been so okay, a couple newer bands that we went to see live in Richmond. Well, one band we went to see live in Richmond, Virginia, which must have been like in 2019, was The Who, not Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend, but the Mongolian folk metal band, The Who.
Really?
Yeah, we saw them live. That was awesome. That was an amazing
Okay.
show. Uh, and uh, and uh, so as I mentioned, but before the recording started rolling, I've recently had knee surgery, So, I can't actually get up out of this chair right now without help. But uh, for when I am recovered, Anita and I have tickets for a band called Heilung or Heilung. I think maybe you say it Heilung. So uh they are this German Scandinavian band that, to my mind, kind of stretch the definition of what metal is, because you listen to them and you're like, okay, that's metal, but they're using they're essentially recreating they're trying to recreate the kind of music that you would have heard back in the times when, say, Beowulf might have actually lived. So
Right.
they're using all these kind of ancient reconstructed instruments, and they have these sort of amazing chanting vocals. Uh and but like they're not like soft and pretty like I can uh I won't say, for the sake of you see my cat pulling at my shirt.
Yeah. Yes.
She wants me to pet her. uh she so she so a visitor to our house, who I will not identify, uh but who is not somebody experienced with the full range of metal the way I am, heard me playing Halum, which is, as I described, this kind of, they use all these primitive instruments and stuff. And she was like, that sounds satanic as hell. Yeah. So we're going to see them live.
It's awesome. Yeah.
Knock on wood that my knee is functional by then. Uh, but yeah,
My
I highly there. If you're not familiar with them, it's Heilung. I recommend looking at any of their videos of their live performances. It's just jaw dropping.
What do
Uh,
you think of all those death metal bands from Florida, like Obituary and like Death and Malevolent Creation and
so I'm probably going to disappoint you here. I'm not that big into death metal, or
okay.
like
Well, no, what you into is what you're into.
right, like I've listened to some of it. I like um oh, damn it, Carcass. Of
Right,
course, they're not from Florida, they're British.
right.
But
They're
I
all
think
like
they
vegan,
qualify.
they're all vegan medical students, and they just say
Right,
that,
right,
yeah.
right. um but I haven't. So there's like I feel like there's sort of for me, there's like sort of a limit that, I think a non-metal fan would just be like, well, how can you tell the difference? But like uh Slayer, like Tom
Uriah, yeah.
Araya's vocals are maybe about as tuneless as I can go and still appreciate the music. Yeah,
I think these are actually super clean vocals.
yeah. And so I've listened to, Cannibal Corpse, and I have, listened some to Death, but I haven't really explored the full range of death metal bands, because I kind of bounce off of I kind of there's a point where I bounce off of it, I guess. And lately I've become more and more interested in well, one of the things that Contrast does, to get way away from death metal, but there's a male vocalist and a female vocalist, and I dig that. And like, so maybe, and like I'm also, and they also do all these wild experiments. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm actually a pretty big fan of baby metal.
Oh no. Oh no, don't tell me
Yeah.
that.
I have not seen them live,
Right.
but uh I don't know, when Give Me Chocolate came out, I just sort of got fascinated and went down a
Well,
rabbit hole.
you know that like the members, they didn't even know metal. They weren't even into metal. They
Oh,
just go,
sure.
"Oh, you're hot Japanese girls. We'll have you play metal, and it'll be different and appeal." And they did, but they'd never done anything metal before.
No, they were plucked out of like a girl group,
Yeah,
and just and they were just kind of, and I guess this is the way that these things can go in the Japanese entertainment industry. They just kind of said, well, we picked you for this, and this is what you're going
right,
to
right.
do now. And they were like, oh, well, okay. But then, so I think it's fascinating that, this is Pandora. You keep saying off. What was fascinating to me was, okay, so they came out with that sort of viral video, which I guess went viral because, oh, those Japanese, or something
Right.
like that. But then they started putting out more and more of these songs, and clearly the people behind the creation of that band were really, really into metal.
Right.
And,
Well,
and
it's possible also the girls are like evolving and learning to
right,
appreciate it and
right.
all that stuff.
And so then all these, so then they actually started doing metal festivals, and all these photographs would pop out with like the baby metal singers like posing with Carcass, posing with Slayer, posing with Metallica, doing the main singer of baby metal doing a duet with Rob Halford of Judas Priest, uh and like it was wild how, like, while sort of the metal fans were like very, very divided about, whether they like this or not. It's like the metal performers were like, oh, this is awesome. you know
Then again, if you're a metal performer and a hot Japanese chick wants to sing metal with you, I don't think you're gonna say no.
well, remember they were like 14 at the
Oh
time.
yeah.
Yeah. So, uh now,
Well, that wouldn't have
now they're
stopped Motley
finally, they
Crue.
actually were babies. Now they're finally, for what it's worth, they're now actually in their 20s.
Yeah.
Uh, but
No, I
that,
think that wouldn't have stopped Tommy from Motley Crue.
well, thank goodness, thank thank goodness that encounter didn't happen, at least not to my knowledge. But I loved how, I guess one of the more famous things that happened from that time, was that, there was, uh, I think I think Rob Zombie like shared some post about baby metal, and all his fans, started dunking on them. And he posted something like, those girls work really hard. You leave them alone. You need to respect them. you know?
People took it a little more seriously after that.
Yeah, yeah. But and of course now, you know, the in their more recent music, the goofiness is actually kind of gone now that it's kind of sound like a power metal band, so
Right.
they've grown up. Uh, but so uh, what I hope you can kind of draw for that is even my taste in metal is sort of all over the place. But I'm definitely, a diehard metal head regardless. Uh,
Right. Well, I don't judge what people are into is what they're into. As long as as long as they're not into something extreme that's hurting other people,
yeah, the
what's you is
black,
you.
Norwegian metal is,
Yeah.
it's sort of fascinating to read about that stuff, but
Although there's a little bit to some of it that because the media loves to jump on stuff, they like to put stereotypes on. Like part of
for
them
sure.
burning churches wasn't because they're quote satanic, is because they said, "Hey, you came and you robbed us of our religion and made us all convert to yours. So
Right,
fuck
right.
you."
Well, yeah, the real stories are always more complicated. Another band I got into, I haven't listened to them a lot lately, but is speaking of Scandinavian, is Ghost.
But
And they're divisive too. There are people who will say they are not
they
metal.
put in a great live show. I've seen them twice live, and it's an amazing
Oh, I'm
show.
jealous. I want to see them live at some point. I haven't managed it yet. Uh,
Yeah, well, the songs kind of go all over the place. Like they'll put it like "Year Zero" is an awesome song,
oh, I
but
love that song.
but then they'll put out like a song that's more like a softer instrumental track. And so it's I think you really need to see them live to kind of get the feeling for it, like
Sure,
all the
sure.
pomp and the ceremony and all that sort of stuff. But all right, man. So I don't want to keep you here all night. I don't
Well,
want to
I've
drag
really
this
enjoyed this
podcast.
conversation. I hope it was something like what you were looking for.
Yeah, no, this is great. Like I said, just want conversation with people. I want people to be themselves. It's like we don't have like a formula. Like we have these 10 questions. You need to answer these 10 questions. It's not like that.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks for appearing on the podcast. Thanks for doing all this, despite your hurt knee and like the computer you haven't used forever that you had to fire up. But
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, well, yeah, sorry about that at the beginning, but yeah, I'm very flattered you asked me and I'm glad to do it. And I guess I have material I need to send you related to all these things we talked about. So I'll have to make sure to do that.
yeah, well, just email me some images and I'll put them up. But I appreciate this. I appreciate you're talking about everything. Like you're going over the routine stuff. Like some people, I haven't really seen it in my podcast, but some people like they don't open up. They're very, very guarded. It's like you don't get anywhere with that. But yeah, no, I appreciate this. Thanks, man.
Great, great. Thank you, Dan, so much for having me.